The pulmonary collapse, 10 catalysts of fatal decay. Every breath is a negotiation with mortality, yet lung cancer remains the undisputed apex predator of oncology, killing more people annually than breast, colon, and prostate cancers combined. While industrial smog draws our ire, a silent molecular insurgency is often fueled by what we ingest. This is a forensic dissection of the carcinogens and inflammatory agents that turn healthy tissue into a terminal diagnosis. Our investigation begins with the absolute architect of respiratory ruin, the single most devastating voluntary exposure in human history. The architect of ruin, cigarettes and the tobacco industrial complex. To classify the cigarette merely as a product is a linguistic failure. It is, in reality, the most efficiently engineered delivery system for toxicological warfare ever devised for civilian consumption. While this list focuses primarily on dietary intake, the inclusion of tobacco is a mandatory physiological baseline because it represents an intake of particulate matter that fundamentally alters the biological landscape in which all other nutrients or toxins operate. When one inhales the combustion byproducts of a modern cigarette, they are not simply engaging in a habit, they are initiating a complex chemical cascade that systematically dismantles the lung's genetic architecture. The cigarette is the undisputed king of carcinogens, responsible for approximately 80% to 90% of lung cancer deaths in the United States. To understand why, we must look past the smoke and into the molecular violence occurring with every inhalation. The science of combustion is the first chapter in this tragedy. When tobacco leaves, cured in sugar and soaked in additives, are burned at temperatures exceeding 1600 degrees Fahrenheit at the tip, the resulting chemical reaction acts as a miniature reactor. This process, known as pyrolysis, transforms the organic matter into a chaotic aerosol containing over 7,000 distinct chemical compounds. Of these, at least 69 are confirmed Class 1 carcinogens. This is not a matter of probability, it is a matter of biological certainty. Among these compounds is benzene, a petrochemical solvent used to manufacture synthetic rubber and dyes, known to cause leukemia and genetic instability. There is formaldehyde, an embalming fluid that acts as a potent irritant to the mucous membranes. Perhaps most insidious is the presence of polonium-210, a highly radioactive element derived from the phosphate fertilizers used in industrial tobacco farming. When a smoker inhales, they are effectively subjecting their bronchial bifurcation to a localized low-dose radiation treatment, creating hotspots of alpha radiation that bombard the sensitive epithelial cells, shattering DNA strands and forcing mutations. The mechanism by which tobacco smoke induces lung cancer is a masterclass in cellular subversion. The human lung is lined with a delicate layer of epithelial cells equipped with cilia, microscopic hair-like structures that beat in rhythmic unison to sweep mucus and trapped particulates out of the airways. This is the body's primary defense system against airborne pathogens. Tobacco smoke acts as a paralytic agent to these cilia. Hydrogen cyanide, another toxic byproduct found in the smoke, stuns the cilia, causing them to stop beating. Over time, chronic exposure kills them entirely. Without this janitorial service, the lungs become a stagnant repository for the tar and toxic sludge inhaled with every puff. This accumulation creates a chronic inflammatory state, a biological zone of conflict where the immune system is in perpetual overdrive. In this chaotic environment, the carcinogens in the tar, specifically polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, and tobacco-specific nitrosamines, TSNAs, bind to the DNA of the lung cells. They form DNA adducts, which are essentially chemical barnacles attached to the genetic code, causing errors during cell replication. The specific target of this molecular vandalism is often the TP53 gene, colloquially known as the guardian of the genome. In a healthy body, the p53 protein identifies damaged DNA and either repairs it or orders the cell to commit suicide, a process called apoptosis. It is the body's emergency brake against cancer. The benzoacypherine found in cigarette smoke has a unique chemical affinity for the TP53 gene, mutating it in a very specific pattern. Once this gene is silenced, the cell loses its ability to regulate its own growth or die when damaged. It becomes immortal, replicating uncontrollably, accumulating more mutations, and eventually forming a malignant tumor. This specific mutation is found in a staggering percentage of lung cancer tumors in smokers, serving as a forensic fingerprint that links the crime directly to the weapon. However, the lethality of the cigarette is not merely an accident of chemistry, it is the result of a century of industrial engineering designed to maximize addiction and inhalation depth. The history of the tobacco industry is a dark chronicle of profit over physiology. In the mid-20th century, as the link between smoking and cancer began to emerge, the industry did not retreat, they optimized. They introduced ventilation holes and filters, which scammed machine tests into reporting lower tar yields, but in practice led smokers to cover the holes with their fingers and inhale more deeply to get the desired nicotine hit. This shift in inhalation mechanics changed the epidemiology of the disease. Where cancers once formed centrally in the upper airways, squamous cell carcinoma, the deeper inhalation forced the smoke into the peripheral distal parts of the lung, leading to a massive rise in adenocarcinoma, a type of cancer that forms in the mucus-secreting glands deep within the tissue. Furthermore, the industry began adding ammonia to the tobacco blend.
This was not for flavor. Ammonia increases the pH of the smoke, converting nicotine into its free base form, which crosses the blood-brain barrier with the speed and intensity of an intravenous injection. This chemical manipulation enslaved the user's neural pathways, ensuring that despite the known risks, despite the coughing, the phlegm, and the warnings, the intake would continue. The sociological and economic footprint of this intake is staggering. For decades, the cigarette was the ultimate cultural signifier of sophistication, rebellion, and relaxation, a narrative carefully curated by billions of dollars in advertising. Today, as smoking rates decline in the West, the industry has aggressively pivoted to the developing world, exporting this carcinogenic crisis to nations with less robust healthcare infrastructures. The World Health Organization estimates that tobacco kills more than 8 million people each year, a number that includes over 1 million non-smokers exposed to secondhand smoke. This secondary exposure is critical to understand. The side stream smoke that drifts from the burning end of a cigarette contains higher concentrations of many carcinogens than the smoke inhaled by the user, because it is produced at a lower temperature with less oxygen, resulting in dirtier combustion. Thus, the intake of tobacco smoke is often involuntary, a forced dietary additive of toxic air imposed on families and coworkers. We must also address the modern evolution of this intake, the electronic cigarette. While often touted as a harm reduction tool, the long-term data on inhaling aerosolized propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, and flavoring agents is non-existent. Early research suggests that while they may lack the tar of combustible tobacco, the heating coils can leach heavy metals like nickel and lead into the lungs, and the flavorings can cause severe bronchiolitis obliterans, popcorn lung, and inflammatory responses. The intake has changed form, but the fundamental assault on lung tissue remains a concern.
The lung was evolved to process a mixture of nitrogen, oxygen, and argon, nothing else. Any other intake is a physiological insult. Ultimately, the cessation of this intake is the single most effective medical intervention available to humanity. The regenerative capacity of the human body is remarkable. Within years of quitting, the risk of lung cancer drops significantly, though it never quite returns to the baseline of a never smoker. The cilia can regrow, the inflammation can subside, and the DNA repair mechanisms can resume their watch. But for those who continue the intake, the cigarette remains a slow-motion execution, a product that kills half of its long-term users when used exactly as intended. It is the foundational entry on this list because no amount of kale, antioxidants, or clean living can neutralize the constant radioactive, carcinogenic bombardment of tobacco smoke. It is the darkness against which all other health choices are measured.
2. The preserved poison, processed meats, and the nitrate conspiracy. If tobacco is the clear villain of respiratory health, processed meat is the insidious double agent, a beloved dietary staple that hides a carcinogenic payload beneath a facade of tradition and savory flavor. For decades, the American breakfast table, the ballpark hot dog, and the holiday ham have been centerpieces of culinary culture. Yet beneath the smoky aroma and the salty cure lies a biological hazard so potent that in 2015, the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, classified processed meat as a Group 1 carcinogen. This designation places bacon, sausage, salami, and pepperoni in the same evidence-based category as tobacco smoking, asbestos, and plutonium. While the potency is lower, eating a BLT is not the same as smoking a pack a day, the strength of the evidence linking it to cancer is identical. While the primary association is often with colorectal cancer, deep investigative analysis reveals that the systemic inflammation and oxidative stress caused by these foods have profound implications for lung health, particularly in the context of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, and lung carcinogenesis. To understand the danger, we must deconstruct the definition of processed. This is not merely meat that has been cooked, it is meat that has been transformed through salting, curing, fermentation, smoking, or other processes to enhance flavor or improve preservation. The industrialization of this process has introduced a chemical cocktail that the human body is ill-equipped to handle. The primary culprit in this matrix is the use of nitrates and nitrites, sodium nitrite specifically. These compounds are added to meats to preserve their red and pink color. Without them, Bray-oxidized meat would be unpalatable to the modern consumer, and to prevent the growth of Clostridium botulinum. However, when these nitrites enter the human digestive system, particularly in the presence of amino acids, the building blocks of protein, and heme iron abundant in red meat, they undergo a chemical conversion. This conversion occurs largely in the acidic environment of the stomach, where nitrites are transformed into N-nitroso compounds or nitrosamines. Nitrosamines are potent alkylating agents, meaning they can bind to DNA and cause mutations. While the gut takes the direct hit, the impact of nitrosamines is systemic. Once absorbed into the bloodstream,
these compounds circulate, contributing to a body-wide state of oxidative stress. The lungs, being highly vascularized organs that filter the entire blood volume of the body, are uniquely susceptible to circulating toxins. Epidemiological studies have shown a startling correlation. High consumption of cured meats is associated with a significantly increased risk of COPD, a major risk factor for lung cancer. The mechanism appears to be the nitrosamine's ability to damage the structural elasticity of the lung tissue, essentially aging the lungs prematurely and creating a fertile ground for cellular mutation. Furthermore, the method of cooking processed meats exacerbates the risk. Bacon, sausages, and hot dogs are often prepared at high temperatures, fried in a pan or grilled over an open flame. This high heat application to nitrate-laden fatty meat creates a perfect storm of carcinogen formation. In addition to nitrosamines, this cooking process generates heterocyclic amines, or HCAs, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. PAHs, as mentioned in the tobacco section, are the same carcinogenic compounds found in cigarette smoke and coal tar. When fat from a sausage drips onto a hot grill, it flares up, and the smoke that coats the meat is rich in PAHs. Consuming this is, chemically speaking, not entirely unlike licking an ashtray. You are ingesting the byproducts of combustion, which then travel through the system, promoting inflammation and DNA damage. The investigation into processed meats also leads us into the dark heart of industrial food production. The modern hot dog or chicken nugget is often a product of mechanically separated meat, a paste created by forcing bones and carcasses through a sieve under high pressure. This slurry is then reconstituted with fillers, starch, and a heavy load of sodium. The sodium content in processed meats is astronomical, often double or triple that of fresh meat. Excessive sodium intake is not just a cardiovascular issue, it is a driver of cellular swelling and inflammation. In the lungs, sodium imbalance can affect the viscosity of mucus and the hydration of airway surfaces, subtly impairing the lungs' clearance mechanisms. When the immune system is constantly fighting the low-grade inflammation caused by high sodium and chemical additives, its surveillance capacity, the ability to spot and kill a budding cancer cell, is compromised. We must also consider the role of heme iron,
the pigment that gives red meat its color. While iron is essential for life, the specific form found in red and processed meats acts as a catalyst for the formation of N-nitroso compounds in the gut. It also induces lipid peroxidation, a chain reaction of cellular damage that destroys cell membranes. This is oxidative stress in its purest form. The lungs are constantly exposed to oxygen and are therefore highly vulnerable to oxidative damage. A diet high in processed meats effectively lowers the body's antioxidant defenses while simultaneously introducing pro-oxidant agents. It is a war of attrition, and over decades of dietary abuse, the tissue eventually succumbs. The cultural defense of processed meat is strong. Bacon is fetishized in American culture. Hot dogs are synonymous with baseball and patriotism. The industry fights back against the cancer classification with the same vigor the tobacco giants once displayed, funding studies to cast doubt on the data and lobbying against warning labels. They argue that nitrates exist in vegetables like celery and spinach. This is a classic half-truth. While vegetables do contain nitrates, they also contain vitamin C and other antioxidants that naturally inhibit the conversion of nitrates into carcinogenic nitrosamines. Processed meats lack these protective compounds and instead offer a matrix of protein and heme iron that accelerates the formation of the poison. The uncured bacon sold in high-end grocery stores is often a semantic trick. It is cured with celery powder, which is high in naturally occurring nitrates, resulting in the same chemical outcome in the body. The implications of this intake extend to the future of global health. As developing nations adopt the Western diet, their consumption of processed meats is skyrocketing, tracking closely with rising rates of non-communicable diseases. We are witnessing a global shift where the diseases of affluence, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, are becoming the primary killers. The lung, often thought of only in terms of what we breathe, is intimately connected to what we eat. The systemic inflammation triggered by a daily regimen of nitrates, sodium, and saturated fats creates a tumor-promotive environment. For a smoker, eating processed meats is akin to pouring gasoline on a fire. The synergistic effect of the tobacco carcinogens and the dietary nitrosamines creates a risk profile that is exponentially higher than either factor alone.
To remove processed meat from the diet is to remove a significant source of daily chemical assault. It requires a fundamental shift in how we view protein, moving away from the preserved, pink, salty blocks of industrial matter and toward fresh, whole sources. The risk is cumulative. Every strip of bacon is a roll of the dice, a small addition to the body's carcinogenic load. In the grand forensic analysis of lung cancer prevention, avoiding the intake of processed meat is a critical maneuver, second only to the cessation of smoking in preserving the sanctity of the breath.
3. The thermal betrayal, charred meat, and the chemistry of combustion. The allure of the flame is primal. Since the dawn of the Paleolithic era, the mastery of fire has been the defining characteristic of the human species, separating us from the lower order of primates. It allowed for the external digestion of proteins, the expansion of the brain, and the social cohesion of the hearth.
However, in the modern oncological landscape, this ancient romance with fire has revealed a treacherous underbelly. When we subject muscle tissue, beef, pork, poultry, or fish, to the extreme temperatures of an open flame or a scorching metal grate, we are not merely cooking, we are engaging in a chaotic chemical synthesis that transforms essential nutrients into potent genetic mutagens. Entry number 3 on our list, charred or burnt meat, represents the thermal betrayal, a process where the very method used to make food safe and palatable creates a matrix of carcinogenic compounds that target the cellular integrity of the lungs and other organs. To understand the severity of this risk, we must descend into the molecular violence of the Maillard reaction and its darker sibling, pyrolysis. When meat is exposed to high temperatures, specifically those exceeding 300 degrees Fahrenheit, and continued until the surface blackens, carbonizes, two primary classes of carcinogenic compounds are formed, heterocyclic amines, HCAs, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs. These are not naturally occurring substances in the raw animal, they are the direct byproducts of thermal abuse. HCAs are formed through the reaction of amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, sugars, and creatine, a substance found in muscle. This is a specific chemical alchemy that requires the precise biological makeup of muscle tissue to occur. You do not, for example, get HCAs when you burn a vegetable. The heat energy forces these benign molecules to snap apart and recombine into complex ring structures that the human body recognizes as toxic invaders. The formation of HCAs is directly proportional to the temperature and the duration of the heat exposure. A steak ordered well done or a chicken breast left on the grill until it develops a thick blackened crust can contain substantial concentrations of these mutagens. Among the most potent of these are FIP and MEC-IQX, compounds that have been extensively studied in laboratory settings. When ingested, these chemicals are not immediately toxic.
They travel to the liver, where they undergo bioactivation. In a cruel twist of biological irony, the enzymes in the liver, specifically the cytochrome P450 family, attempt to metabolize these compounds to excrete them. However, for HCAs, this metabolic process actually activates them, turning them into reactive metabolites capable of binding to DNA. These metabolites circulate through the bloodstream, reaching the highly vascularized tissue of the lungs. Once there, they can form DNA adducts, essentially chemical staples that fuse to the genetic double helix, causing errors during cell division that can initiate the cancerous process. While HCAs are formed inside the meat, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, attack from the outside. PAHs are formed when fat and juices from the meat drip onto the heat source, the charcoal briquettes or the gas burner. The fat undergoes incomplete combustion, flaring up in bursts of smoke. This smoke is not merely flavor, it is a volatile aerosol of toxic carbon rings. As the smoke rises, it deposits these PAHs on the surface of the meat. This is the same class of chemical compounds found in cigarette smoke, automobile exhaust, and the soot that caused scrotal cancer in 18th century chimney sweeps, the first occupational cancer ever identified. When you eat a piece of meat that has been heavily smoked or charred over an open flame, you are ingesting a concentrated dose of the same carcinogens that a smoker inhales. The link between PAHs and lung cancer is well established in occupational medicine, but the dietary pathway is increasingly scrutinized. The lung is a unique organ. It acts as a filter for the entire blood volume. Circulating carcinogens derived from the gut can induce inflammation and oxidative stress in the pulmonary tissue. Moreover, the consumption of high levels of PAHs contributes to the body's total carcinogenic lung. The body has a finite capacity to repair DNA damage. When the repair systems are overwhelmed by a barrage of toxins from multiple sources, air pollution, passive smoke, and dietary intake, the risk of malignancy spikes. The charred skin of a chicken wing or the blackened bark of a brisket represents a concentrated delivery system for these compounds. This issue also touches upon the genetics of metabolism. Not every individual who eats charred meat will develop cancer.
This variability is partly due to genetic polymorphisms in the enzymes responsible for metabolizing HCAs and PAHs. Some individuals possess fast or slow versions of these enzymes, affecting how quickly the toxins are activated or cleared from the body. For those with a specific genetic profile, the consumption of burnt meat is significantly more dangerous, acting as a rapid accelerator for mutagenesis. This genetic lottery makes the universal recommendation to avoid charred meat even more critical, as most individuals do not know their enzymatic profile. Culturally, the avoidance of charred meat faces immense resistance. The char is often feted as the pinnacle of culinary technique. In the American South, the bark on barbecue is prized. In steakhouses, the Pittsburgh rare style demands a charred exterior. This culinary aesthetic creates a cognitive dissonance. The flavor profile we have evolved to crave, the savory, smoky complexity of brown meat, is the sensory signal of the presence of carcinogens. This is an evolutionary trap. In the days of early man, the risk of cancer in old age was irrelevant compared to the immediate caloric benefit of cooked meat. Today, in a world of longevity, that trade-off is no longer viable. The
The mitigation of this risk requires a fundamental change in cooking behavior. It is not necessary to abandon meat entirely to avoid HCAs and PAHs, but the method must change. Cooking at lower temperatures, using marinades, which can create a barrier and reduce HCA formation by up to 90% by utilizing antioxidants and herbs, and flipping meat frequently to prevent surface overheating are all effective strategies. However, the most effective step is the excision of the blackened parts. That crunchy, carbonized edge is not a treat, it is hazardous waste. Furthermore, we must consider the broader implications of a diet heavy in high-temperature cooked meats. These foods are often pro-inflammatory, independent of their mutagenic content. Chronic inflammation is the soil in which lung cancer seeds grow. By constantly irritating the system with oxidized proteins and lipids, we create a physiological environment where the immune system is distracted, allowing rogue cells to proliferate. This thermal betrayal is a reminder that cooking is chemistry, and like any chemical reaction, if pushed to extremes, it yields toxic byproducts. The blackened crust is a warning sign,
a visual indicator that the food has crossed the line from nourishment to toxicity.
4. The golden toxin, deep-fried foods and the lipid oxidation crisis. If charred meat is the result of thermal violence, deep-fried food is the product of thermal endurance, the submersion of organic matter into a superheated bath of lipids until it undergoes a total structural metamorphosis. Entry number 4, deep-fried foods, represents one of the most pervasive and damaging dietary habits in the modern world. From the ubiquitous French fry to the southern staple of fried chicken, these foods are the cornerstones of the fast food empire. However, beneath the golden, crispy exterior lies a complex matrix of oxidized fats, inflammatory agents, and neurotoxic compounds that assault the body's metabolic and respiratory health. The connection between deep-fried foods and lung cancer is multifaceted, involving not just the systemic inflammation caused by ingestion, but the direct respiratory assault caused by the very act of cooking them. The investigation begins with the oil itself. Vegetable oils, soybean, corn, canola, sunflower, are chemically unstable at high temperatures. When these oils are heated to frying temperatures, typically 350 degrees Fahrenheit to 375 degrees Fahrenheit, and exposed to oxygen and moisture from the food, they undergo a rapid degradation process known as hydrolysis, oxidation, and polymerization. This breaks down the triglycerides into free fatty acids and glycerol, and subsequently into a cascade of volatile and non-volatile polar compounds. These degradation products are highly reactive free radicals. When you consume deep-fried food, you are not just eating fat, you are eating rancid, oxidized fat. This acts as a systemic pro-oxidant, stripping electrons from healthy cells and damaging cell membranes throughout the body. For the lungs, this systemic oxidative stress is catastrophic. The lung tissue is constantly exposed to high concentrations of oxygen, making it uniquely susceptible to oxidative damage. A diet high in oxidized fats depletes the body's stores of antioxidants, like vitamin E, leaving the lungs vulnerable to environmental insults. Furthermore, the consumption of fried foods is a primary driver of obesity and metabolic syndrome. Adipose tissue, body fat, is not biologically inert. It is an active endocrine organ that secretes pro-inflammatory cytokines, such as interleukin-6, IL-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF-alpha. This creates a state of chronic low-grade inflammation.
Epidemiological data consistently shows that chronic inflammation is a precursor to lung cancer, creating a microenvironment where tumor cells can thrive and metastasize. However, the most chilling and direct link between frying and lung cancer lies in the chemistry of the potato and the breading. When starchy foods are fried at high temperatures, a reaction occurs between sugars and an amino acid called asparagine. This reaction produces acrylamide. Discovered in food only as recently as 2002 by Swedish scientists, acrylamide is a known neurotoxin and a probable human carcinogen. It is used industrially to make polyacrylamide gels and in the treatment of drinking water, yet it is produced in massive quantities in French fries and potato chips. In animal models, acrylamide exposure has been definitively linked to the development of tumors in multiple organs, including the lungs. It is a genotoxic compound, meaning it damages the genetic material directly. Every serving of fries is a dose of this industrial chemical. But the investigation into deep-fried foods yields an even more disturbing vector for lung cancer risk: cooking oil fumes, COF. This is a critical, often overlooked factor that blurs the line between dietary choice and environmental exposure. When oil is heated to its smoke point, it releases plumes of volatile organic compounds, VOCs, including aldehydes such as acrolein, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, and fine particulate matter. Acrolein in particular is a potent respiratory irritant and carcinogen that destroys the DNA of lung cells and inhibits the immune system's ability to clear tumors. This phenomenon explains a long-standing medical mystery: the high rates of lung cancer among non-smoking women in Asian countries. Epidemiological studies in China and Taiwan have repeatedly identified exposure to high-temperature wok frying as a primary risk factor for lung adenocarcinoma in women who have never touched a cigarette. The intake here is dual-pronged. The cook inhales the mutagenic fumes while preparing the meal, and then the family ingests the oxidized lipids and acrylamide while eating it. This makes deep frying a unique hazard to the culinary world, a preparation method that is carcinogenic to the chef and the consumer simultaneously. In professional settings such as fast food kitchens, the ventilation is often insufficient to handle the volume of aerosolized grease and aldehydes,
placing workers at significant risk. The industrial nature of deep frying exacerbates these dangers. In a home kitchen, one might use oil once or twice. In a fast food establishment, the oil is kept hot for 12 to 18 hours a day and used for days at a time. This continuous heating accelerates the formation of total polar compounds, TPCs. As the oil ages, it becomes a thicker, darker, more toxic sludge. The viscosity increases, meaning more of this degraded oil is absorbed into the food. A fry cooked in fresh oil absorbs some fat. A fry cooked in degraded viscous oil acts like a sponge, soaking up a massive load of polymers and oxidized monomers. This is what the consumer eats, a delivery vehicle for broken, toxic chemistry. We must also address the historical context of trans fats. For decades, the frying industry relied on partially hydrogenated oils because they were stable and cheap. These trans fats were eventually banned or phased out in many jurisdictions due to their devastating impact on heart health. However, the replacement oils, often high in omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, are actually more prone to oxidation and the formation of carcinogenic aldehydes when heated than the trans fats were. We traded cardiovascular plaque for cellular mutation. The healthier vegetable oils break down faster into the toxic fumes and free radicals that threaten lung health. The cultural grip of fried food is perhaps even tighter than that of charred meat. It is the food of comfort, of celebration, and of economic necessity. It is cheap to produce and highly palatable due to the density of calories and the texture. The crunch of a fried item is a sensory superstimulus. Breaking this addiction requires navigating a landscape where healthy food is expensive and perishable, while a bag of fries is cheap and eternal. From a future perspective, the technology of frying is attempting to pivot. Air fryers has surged in popularity, promising the texture of frying without the oil. While this reduces the lipid oxidation and the aldehyde fumes, it does not eliminate acrylamide, which forms due to the heat and the starch regardless of the medium. The danger remains intrinsic to the high heat processing of these carbohydrates. In the final analysis, deep-fried foods represent a golden toxin. They are visually appealing, texturally perfect, and chemically disastrous.
They assault the lungs through two distinct pathways: the systemic inflammation and oxidative stress caused by ingestion, and the direct carcinogenic action of the fumes generated during cooking. To protect the lungs is to reject the fryer. It is to understand that the golden crust is not a seal of flavor, but a marker of degradation, a sign that the food has been subjected to a process that turns sustenance into a slow-acting poison. The elimination of deep-fried foods is a non-negotiable step in the pursuit of respiratory longevity and cancer prevention.
5. The liquid accelerator, sugary drinks, and the metabolic hijack. In the vast and complex investigation into the environmental causes of carcinoma, the focus is almost exclusively placed on airborne toxins: asbestos, radon, particulate matter, and tobacco smoke. We naturally assume that a disease of the lungs must be caused by what we breathe. However, modern oncology has begun to unveil a terrifying truth. The fuel for cancer's aggressive expansion is often poured from a can or a bottle. Entry number 5, sugary drinks, encompassing soda, sweet tea, energy drinks, and fruit punches, represents the liquid accelerator. These beverages are not merely sources of empty calories, they are potent metabolic disruptors that fundamentally alter the body's hormonal landscape, creating a fertile microenvironment in which lung cancer cells can thrive, multiply, and resist the body's immune defenses. To drink them is to flood the system with the precise fuel that malignancy craves. To understand the lethality of liquid sugar, we must travel back to the 1920s and the laboratory of Nobel laureate Otto Warburg. Warburg made a discovery that remains a cornerstone of cancer biology: the Warburg effect. He observed that unlike healthy cells, which generate energy using oxygen, oxidative phosphorylation, cancer cells have a voracious appetite for glucose and ferment it to produce energy, even when oxygen is present. This inefficient method of energy production requires massive amounts of sugar to sustain the tumor's rapid growth. When one consumes a 20-ounce soda containing 65 grams of sugar, they are essentially mainlining glucose into the bloodstream. For a developing microtumor in the lung, perhaps initiated by a stray particle of tobacco smoke or pollution, this sudden surge of blood sugar is akin to pouring high-octane jet fuel into a smoldering fire. The tumor cells, with their upregulated glucose transporters, greedily absorb this fuel to power their relentless division. But the glucose itself is only the first act in this tragedy. The body's response to this sugar shock is the true architect of ruin. When blood sugar spikes, the pancreas releases a massive wave of insulin to shuttle the glucose into cells. Chronic consumption of sugary drinks leads to a state of hyperinsulinemia, chronically high insulin, and eventually insulin resistance. High levels of insulin are dangerous because insulin is a growth factor. However,
it also triggers the liver to produce an even more potent compound, insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1. IGF-1 is the fertilizer of the cellular world. In a developing child, it is essential for growth. In an adult, however, elevated levels of IGF-1 are a catastrophe. This hormone sends a powerful signal to cells to divide, and crucially, it inhibits apoptosis, the programmed cell death that is the body's natural defense against cancer. Under normal circumstances, if a lung cell's DNA is damaged by a carcinogen, the cell detects the error and commits suicide to protect the organism. IGF-1 overrides the safety switch. It tells the damaged cell to survive and replicate. Epidemiological studies have shown a disturbing correlation. Individuals with higher circulating levels of IGF-1 have a significantly increased risk of developing lung cancer independent of their smoking status. By consuming sugary drinks daily, millions of Americans are keeping their IGF-1 levels permanently elevated, effectively disabling their body's tumor suppression systems. The investigation into sugary drinks must also confront the specific industrial history of high fructose corn syrup, HFCS. Introduced in the 1970s as a cheaper alternative to cane sugar, thanks to government corn subsidies and tariffs on imported sugar, HFCS became the ubiquitous sweetener of the American beverage industry. Fructose is metabolized differently than glucose. It is processed almost entirely by the liver. When the liver is inundated with liquid fructose, which hits the organ with the speed of an injection because there is no fiber to slow absorption, it converts the excess energy directly into visceral fat and liver fat. This leads to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD, a condition now epidemic in the West. Why does a fatty liver matter for the lungs? Because the liver is the primary regulator of systemic inflammation. A fatty, inflamed liver releases a storm of pro-inflammatory cytokines, such as IL-6 and TNF-alpha, into the bloodstream. These inflammatory markers travel to the lungs, creating a state of chronic pulmonary inflammation. We know that chronic inflammation is the soil in which cancer grows. It promotes angiogenesis, the creation of new blood vessels to feed tumors, and metastasis. The soda drinker is thus caught in a pincer movement. The glucose feeds the tumor via the Warburg effect. The insulin IGF-1 axis prevents the cancer cells from dying.
And the fructose-induced liver inflammation weakens the immune system's ability to fight back. We must also scrutinize the cultural phenomenon of sweet tea and the demographic overlaps with lung cancer. In the American South, often referred to as the stroke belt or the diabetes belt, sweet tea is a cultural staple, often consumed by the gallon. This region also historically has some of the highest smoking rates and the highest lung cancer mortality rates in the nation. While smoking is the primary driver, the synergistic effect of a high-sugar diet cannot be ignored. The metabolic dysfunction caused by the sugar creates a body that is less able to repair the damage caused by the smoke. It is a double-hit hypothesis. The smoke damages the DNA, and the sugar creates the hormonal environment that allows that damage to spiral into a tumor. Furthermore, the beverage industry's role in this health crisis parallels the tactics of the tobacco industry. For decades, Big Soda has funded research to downplay the metabolic risks of sugar, trying to shift the focus entirely to calories in, calories out, and physical activity. They have aggressively marketed these products to lower socioeconomic demographics and minority communities, groups that already face higher environmental burdens and healthcare disparities. The energy drink sector is particularly insidious, marketing massive doses of sugar and caffeine to young people as fuel for performance, when in reality it is fuel for metabolic derangement. The sheer volume of sugar in these cans, often exceeding the daily recommended limit in a single serving, represents a physiological assault that the human pancreas was never evolved to handle. The connection extends to the physical structure of the lung itself. High sugar intake promotes a process called glycation, where sugar molecules bind to proteins and fats without enzymatic control, forming advanced glycation end products, AGEs. These AGEs damage the collagen and elastin in the lung tissue, reducing lung elasticity and function. This stiffening of the lung tissue mimics the aging process and makes the lungs more susceptible to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, which is itself a major independent risk factor for lung cancer. The sugar is literally caramelizing the lung tissue from the inside out, making it brittle and prone to disease. In the future landscape of oncology,
Metabolic health will likely be seen as equal in importance to genetic factors. The lipid accelerator is a modifiable risk factor. Removing sugary drinks from the diet is not just a weight loss strategy, it is an anti-cancer strategy. It lowers insulin, reduces IGF-1, starves potential tumors of their preferred fuel, and reduces systemic inflammation. Water, unsweetened tea, and black coffee are the fluids of life. Sugary sodas are the fluids of pathology. In the stark light of forensic analysis, the daily soda habit is a slow-motion act of self-sabotage, priming the body for the very disease we fear most.
6. The industrial illusion, ultra-processed snacks, and the gut-lung axis. If sugary drinks are the fuel, ultra-processed snacks are the structural saboteurs of human health. Entry number 6 takes us into the aisles of the supermarket dominated by colorful bags of chips, packaged cookies, cheese-flavored puffs, and snack cakes. These items are not food in the traditional agrarian sense. They are industrial formulations, engineered in laboratories to maximize palatability and shelf life while minimizing cost. They are the defining intake of the modern era, comprising nearly 60% of the average American's caloric intake. However, the deep investigative lens reveals that these ultra-processed foods, UPFs, are driving a wedge between the body's immune system and its ability to defend the lungs, primarily by destroying the critical biological alliance known as the gut-lung axis. To define the enemy, we use the NOVA classification system developed by researchers at the University of Sao Paulo. Group 4, ultra-processed foods, are defined by what they contain: substances never found in a kitchen, hydrolyzed proteins, invert sugar, ultra-texturin, high-fructose corn syrup, and cosmetic additives, flavors, color enhancers, emulsifiers, designed to mimic the sensory qualities of real food. When you eat a bag of spicy tortilla chips, you are not eating corn and spices. You are eating a matrix of refined starch, industrial seed oils, and chemical additives designed to hit the bliss point, the precise combination of salt, sugar, and fat that overrides the brain's satiety signals. The primary mechanism by which UPFs threaten lung health is through the destruction of the microbiome. The human gut is home to trillions of bacteria that play a gut-lung axis. The bacteria in the colon ferment fiber to produce short-chain fatty acids like butyrate. These SCFAs enter the bloodstream and travel to the lungs, where they reduce inflammation and help the pulmonary immune cells, macrophages, distinguish between harmless dust and dangerous pathogens or cancer cells. UPFs are by design devoid of fiber. Without fiber, the beneficial bacteria starve. Worse, the additives in UPFs actively kill them. Consider emulsifiers such as carbomethylcellulose and polysorbate 80, commonly found in packaged cookies and creamy snacks to improve texture and shelf stability.
Research has shown that these detergents strip away the protective mucus layer of the gut, allowing bacteria to come into direct contact with the intestinal wall. This causes leaky gut, intestinal permeability, allowing toxins and bacterial fragments, lipopolysaccharides, to leak into the bloodstream. Once in circulation, these toxins trigger systemic inflammation. The lungs, being highly vascularized, are bathed in this inflammatory blood. A study published in the journal Nutrients found that high consumption of UPFs was associated with wheezing and lower lung function. A compromised gut leads to a compromised lung. When the lung's immune system is constantly distracted by systemic inflammation stemming from the gut, its surveillance mechanism, the ability to spot and destroy early-stage cancer cells, fails. We must also investigate the fats used in these snacks. UPFs are the primary delivery vehicle for industrial seed oils: soybean, cottonseed, corn, sunflower oil. These oils are rich in omega-6 fatty acids, specifically linoleic acid. While essential in small amounts, the modern diet provides a ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 that is vastly out of balance, often 20:1 compared to the evolutionary 1:1. High levels of omega-6 are converted into arachidonic acid, which the body uses to produce pro-inflammatory eicosanoids. By consuming chips and crackers fried in these oils, we are building our cell membranes out of inflammatory building blocks. In the context of lung cancer, this is disastrous. Inflammation is the driver of tumor progression. A diet high in UPFs creates a pro-tumorigenic environment where inflammation runs rampant and resolution mechanisms are silenced. The chemical additives in these snacks also warrant a forensic toxicology report. Titanium dioxide, used to make ranch dressing white or powdered donuts bright, has been banned in the European Union as a genotoxin capable of damaging DNA, but remains legal in the US. Artificial colors like red 40 and yellow 5 are derived from petroleum and are contaminated with benzidine, a known carcinogen. While the amounts in a single serving are small, the cumulative intake over a lifetime of snacking is the concern. We are conducting a massive, uncontrolled experiment on the human population, introducing thousands of novel chemical compounds into the digestive tract and assuming they will have no effect on distal organs like the lungs. Historically,
the rise of UPFs correlates perfectly with the rise of chronic non-communicable diseases. The post-World War II era saw the weaponization of food technology. The same technologies used to create rations for soldiers were repurposed to create TV dinners and vending machine snacks. The convenience narrative was sold to the American public, masking the reality that nutrient density was being traded for caloric density. This shift has resulted in a phenomenon known as type B malnutrition, where an individual is obese and calorie-rich, yet starving of essential micronutrients. This nutrient displacement is a critical, often overlooked factor in lung cancer risk. Every time a person chooses a bag of chips for a snack, they are not choosing an apple, a handful of nuts, or a piece of broccoli. They are displacing foods rich in chemopreventive agents. Lung cancer protection relies heavily on antioxidants like vitamin C, vitamin E, carotenoids, and flavonoids found in plants. These compounds neutralize the free radicals caused by breathing polluted air. A diet of UPFs is a diet of oxidative debt. You are consuming pro-oxidant fats and sugars while simultaneously starving the body of the antioxidants needed to repair the damage. It is a strategic disarmament of the body's defenses. The psychological engineering of these foods is also relevant. Howard Moskowitz, a legendary food industry consultant, pioneered the concept of the bliss point. The industry knows exactly how to formulate a chip so that the texture, the mouthfeel, and the flavor burst dissipate quickly, tricking the brain into thinking no calories were consumed, driving the user to eat the entire bag. This leads to obesity, and adipose tissue is a major endocrine disruptor.
Deep visceral fat driven by UPF consumption secretes hormones and cytokines that alter lung mechanics and immune function. Obesity is now recognized as a risk factor for multiple cancers, and its contribution to lung cancer mortality is becoming clearer, particularly through the pathway of chronic low-grade inflammation. The cultural impact is devastating. UPFs are the cheapest calories available. In food deserts where fresh produce is scarce, the bodega shelf is stocked with honey buns and spicy chips. This creates a socioeconomic disparity in cancer risk. The populations most exposed to industrial pollution and higher smoking rates are often the same populations most reliant on UPFs due to cost and availability.
This is a synergistic tragedy where environment, addiction, and diet converge to destroy lung health. Looking to the future, the classification of UPFs is likely to become a central pillar of public health policy. Just as we now tax tobacco and warn against alcohol, the frankenfoods of the center aisle will eventually face scrutiny for their role in the chronic disease epidemic. The evidence is mounting that the processing itself, the physical and chemical deconstruction of the food matrix, is the problem. To lower the risk of lung cancer, one must opt out of this industrial food chain. It requires a return to whole, intact foods that feed the microbiome rather than destroying it. The bag of chips is not an innocent treat. It is a chemically engineered disruptor that severs the gut-lung axis, leaving the respiratory system vulnerable to the dark lottery of carcinogenesis. The illusion of the colorful package hides a gray reality of cellular decay.
In the pantheon of human vices, alcohol occupies a privileged seat. It is the social lubricant of civilization, the ceremonial fluid of celebration, and the anesthetic of the weary. Yet beneath the clinking glasses and the warm euphoria lies a molecular reality that is fundamentally hostile to cellular integrity. Entry number 7, alcohol, specifically heavy and chronic consumption, represents a solvent of synergistic ruin. While the liver is the primary organ associated with alcohol-induced pathology, the lungs are intimately and devastatingly involved in the metabolism and excretion of ethanol. The connection between alcohol and lung cancer is not merely statistical, it is a complex biological interplay involving volatility, oxidative stress, and a terrifying synergy with tobacco that amplifies the carcinogenic potential of smoking to catastrophic levels. To drink heavily is to strip the body of its defenses, leaving the respiratory system naked before its enemies. The investigation into alcohol's role in lung carcinogenesis begins with the simple physiology of the breathalyzer. When a police officer asks a driver to blow into a tube to measure blood alcohol content, they are relying on a fundamental biological fact. Alcohol is volatile, it evaporates. When ethanol is ingested, it is absorbed into the bloodstream and pumped to the heart, which then sends it directly to the lungs for oxygenation. Because ethanol is volatile at body temperature, a portion of it diffuses out of the pulmonary capillaries and into the air sacs alveoli of the lungs, where it is exhaled. This means that the delicate epithelial tissue of the lungs is bathed in ethanol vapor with every breath a drinker takes. The lung is not just a passive observer of intoxication, it is an active participant in the excretion of the toxin. This continuous exposure to ethanol vapor creates a localized environment of toxicity. However, the ethanol itself is only the delivery vehicle. The true assassin is its primary metabolite, acetaldehyde. When the body breaks down alcohol, enzymes known as alcohol dehydrogenases convert it into acetaldehyde. This compound is chemically reactive and highly toxic. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, classifies acetaldehyde associated with alcohol consumption as a Group 1 carcinogen. It damages DNA by interfering with replication and inhibiting the body's ability to repair that damage. While the liver does the heavy lifting of metabolism, the lungs also possess enzymes, specifically cytochrome P450-2E1 or CYP2E1, that metabolize alcohol. In chronic drinkers, the levels of CYP2E1 in the lungs are upregulated. The body tries to adapt to the poison by building more processing machinery. Crucially, the activity of CYP2E1 generates massive amounts of reactive oxygen species, RLS, free radicals that cause oxidative stress. This creates a perfect storm in the lung tissue, the presence of the carcinogen acetaldehyde combined with a flood of free radicals that shred cellular membranes and mutate DNA. The most insidious aspect of alcohol consumption in the context of lung cancer is its relationship with tobacco. This is the synergy that turns a risk into a death sentence. Historically and culturally, drinking and smoking are twin behaviors. The bar is the natural habitat of the cigarette, but the biological interaction is where the horror lies. Ethanol acts as a solvent. The cells lining the upper respiratory tract in the lungs are covered in a protective mucus layer and a cellular membrane. Alcohol dissolves these lipid boundaries. It effectively strips away the armor of the throat and lung tissue, increasing the permeability of the cells. When a person takes a drag of a cigarette while drinking, the tar and carcinogens from the smoke are not just sitting on the surface, they are dissolved by the alcohol and carried deep into the cellular basements. The alcohol opens the door and the tobacco walks in. Epidemiological data confirms this multiplier effect. The risk of cancer in someone who smokes and drinks is not simply the sum of the two risks, A plus B, it is exponential, A times B. Furthermore, we must examine the phenomenon of the alcoholic lung. This is a distinct clinical phenotype recognized in critical care medicine.
Chronic alcohol ingestion depletes the lung's stores of glutathione, the master antioxidant. Glutathione is the lung's primary defense against oxidative damage. Without it, the lung tissue is defenseless against the oxygen-rich environment it functions in, let alone the toxins introduced by pollution or smoke. This depletion leads to dysfunction in the alveolar macrophages, the immune cells they patrol the air sacs. These cells are the janitors and the soldiers of the lungs,
responsible for eating bacteria and destroying abnormal cells. Alcohol paralyzes them. This is why heavy drinkers are vastly more susceptible to pneumonia and tuberculosis. In the context of cancer, a suppressed immune surveillance system means that when a cell mutates, the police are asleep, allowing the rogue cell to establish a colony and grow into a tumor. The nutritional devastation caused by alcohol also plays a pivotal role. Alcohol interferes with the absorption and metabolism of folate, vitamin B9. Folate is essential for DNA synthesis and methylation, the process by which the body turns genes on and off. Proper methylation is required to keep tumor suppressor genes active. When folate levels drop due to alcohol interference, the DNA becomes unstable and hypomethylation occurs. This can lead to the accidental activation of oncogenes, cancer-causing genes that should have remained dormant. Thus, the drinker is attacking their genetic stability from two angles, directly damaging the DNA with acetaldehyde and simultaneously removing the raw materials needed to maintain genetic order. We must also consider the additives in alcoholic beverages. The modern cocktail or craft beer is not just ethanol and water. Dark liquors, whiskey, bourbon, and red wines contain congeners, chemical byproducts of fermentation like tannins, acetone, and furfural. While these contribute to flavor and the severity of hangovers, their long-term interaction with lung tissue is less understood, but potentially additive to the inflammatory load. Moreover, the mixer is often a sugary drink, entry number 5, compounding the metabolic damage with insulin spikes and IGF-1 elevation, further promoting tumor growth. The cultural narrative surrounding alcohol often shields it from the level of scrutiny applied to cigarettes. We toast to health, yet we are ingesting a substance that the National Toxicology Program lists as a known human carcinogen. The French paradox, the idea that red wine is heart-healthy, has often been used to justify heavy consumption. But from an oncological perspective, the data regarding cancer risk is unforgiving. Even moderate drinking increases the risk of several cancers. For the lung specifically, the risk is inextricably tied to the lifestyle factors that accompany drinking, but the direct biological toxicity of the ethanol vapor and the glutathione depletion proves that alcohol is an independent bad actor in respiratory health.
The future of this investigation points toward genetics. We know that certain populations, particularly those of East Asian descent, lack the enzyme aldehyde dehydrogenase, ALDH2, which breaks down acetaldehyde. When these individuals drink, acetaldehyde accumulates rapidly, causing the Asian flush. For these individuals, the carcinogenic risk of alcohol is vastly higher because their tissues are exposed to the mutagen for longer periods. As genetic testing becomes widespread, we may find that a significant portion of the population is genetically ill-equipped to handle ethanol, making every drink a game of Russian roulette with their DNA. Ultimately, the reduction of alcohol intake is a critical step in lowering the carcinogenic load of the body. To protect the lungs, one must ensure that the immune system is alert, that the antioxidant reservoirs are full, and that the cellular membranes are intact. Heavy alcohol use compromises all three mechanisms. It turns the respiratory system into a chemically volatile zone, stripped of its defenses and awash in free radicals. In the forensic accounting of lung cancer causes, the bottle may not pull the trigger, but it undoubtedly loads the gun and holds the door open for the killer.
8. The crystalline scourge, high salt processed foods and the inflammatory tide. Salt is the crystal of life. Without sodium, the human heart would cease to beat and the neurons would cease to fire. It is so essential that civilizations were built around salt mines and soldiers were paid in salary, derived from the Latin sal. However, in the modern industrial food complex, this life-giving mineral has been weaponized. Entry number 8, high salt processed foods, epitomized by instant noodles, canned soups, and savory snack mixes, represents the crystalline scourge. The danger here is not the pinch of salt added to a home-cooked meal, but the astronomical physiological shock levels of sodium hidden within ultra-processed matrices. This excess sodium does not merely raise blood pressure, it fundamentally alters the immune system, promotes systemic inflammation, and creates a pathway for lung damage through mechanisms that are both chemical and mechanical. To understand the scale of the threat, we must look at the instant noodle as the archetype of this category. Invented in post-war Japan as a solution to hunger, it has become a global staple. A single block of instant noodles, along with its seasoning packet, can contain over 2,000 milligrams of sodium, nearly the entire recommended daily limit for an adult, in one sitting. But the sodium is not traveling alone. It is accompanied by tertiary butyl hydroquinone,
TBHQ, a synthetic antioxidant derived from petroleum used to prevent the fat in the noodles from going rancid. It is accompanied by monosodium glutamate, MSG, for umami enhancement. The noodle itself is flash fried, meaning it carries the oxidized lipid load discussed in entry number 4. When this chemical brick is consumed, the body undergoes an immediate state of osmotic panic. The primary mechanism linking high salt intake to lung cancer is inflammation. Sodium is a potent regulator of the immune system. High salt intake has been shown to induce the differentiation of Th17 cells, T helper 17 cells. These are a subset of immune cells that are highly pro-inflammatory. While they are necessary for fighting certain bacterial infections, when they are chronically overactivated by a high salt diet, they turn against the body, promoting autoimmune diseases and creating a systemic environment of chronic inflammation. As we have established throughout this investigation, chronic inflammation is the precursor to cancer. It damages tissues,
increases cell turnover, and generates free radicals. A study published in the American Journal of Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine has suggested that high sodium intake is associated with an increased risk of asthma and lower lung function, indicators of inflammatory stress in the pulmonary tissue. But the investigation uncovers a more direct mechanical pathway to lung damage: gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD, and microaspiration. High-salt foods are a primary trigger for gastric inflammation and acid reflux. The stomach lining is irritated by the hypertonic saline environment, leading to gastritis, and is a primary cause of stomach cancer. However, the damage travels upward. Chronic reflux causes stomach acid and enzymes, pepsin, to travel up the esophagus. In many people, specifically while sleeping, microscopic droplets of this acid are inhaled, aspirated into the lungs. This is silent aspiration. When lung tissue is repeatedly burned by stomach acid, it undergoes a cycle of injury and repair. This chronic irritation leads to fibrosis, scarring of the lung tissue. Idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, IPF, is a serious lung disease that shares many risk factors with lung cancer. The constant cellular turnover required to repair the acid burns increases the likelihood of a replication error, a mutation. Over decades, the instant noodle habit may result in thousands of nights of microaspiration, slowly scarring the lungs and creating a fertile ground for adenocarcinoma. The crystalline scourge thus attacks the lungs from below, turning the stomach into a reservoir of chemical weaponry that spills over into the airways. We must also scrutinize the preservatives that invariably accompany high-salt foods. The aforementioned TBHQ is a subject of intense toxicological debate. While approved by the FDA in small amounts, studies in animal models have suggested that long-term exposure can lead to DNA damage and the development of cancerous precursors in the stomach and lungs. In the world of industrial soup and noodles, salt is never just salt. It is part of a preservation system designed to make food immortal. By eating food that cannot die, decompose, we may be hastening our own mortality. The socioeconomic dimension of high-salt processed foods is profound. These are the cheapest calories in existence. For a college student, a low-income family, or a worker in a developing nation, the instant noodle is a survival ration.
This creates a disparity in lung cancer risk that tracks with poverty. The ramen diet is often joked about, but biologically it is a tragedy. It represents a form of malnutrition where the individual is calorically sufficient but chemically poisoned. In Asia, where consumption of salted preserved foods like salted fish and pickled vegetables is culturally entrenched and overlaps with the modern instant noodle market, rates of stomach and lung cancers are distinct from Western patterns. The Cantonese-style salted fish, for instance, is a known Group 1 carcinogen linked to nasopharyngeal carcinoma, a cancer of the upper airway, proving that salted preservation generates potent carcinogens, nitrosamines, that target the respiratory tract. Furthermore, excess sodium disrupts the balance of fluids in the lung tissue. The interstitium of the lung must maintain a precise hydration level for gas exchange and for the mucociliary escalator to function. Hypernatremia, high sodium, can dehydrate the mucous membranes, making the mucus thick and sticky, similar to the effects of cystic fibrosis, though to a much lesser degree. Thick mucus cannot effectively clear trapped carcinogens, dust, smoke, pollution, from the lungs. By impairing the lungs' self-cleaning mechanism, high-salt foods indirectly increase the residence time of airborne toxins in the airways. The industrial palate has been trained to accept these levels of salt. If you feed a person used to processed soups a homemade broth with normal salt levels, they will find it tasteless. This neuroadaptation makes quitting processed foods difficult. The industry knows this. Salt is the cheapest flavor enhancer available. It masks the metallic taste of canning and the stale taste of cheap ingredients. It is the mask that hides the low quality of the food. Looking forward, the global health community is waging a war on sodium, but the focus is almost entirely on cardiovascular health, blood pressure, and stroke. The link to cancer, particularly via the inflammatory and reflux pathways, is the dark matter of sodium research, massive in influence but difficult to see directly. However, the forensic evidence is mounting. The body is a unified system. You cannot inflame the vasculature and the gut without consequences for the lungs. To lower the risk of lung cancer, one must break the addiction to the crystalline scourge.
It involves rejecting the shelf-stable convenience of the styrofoam cup and the foil packet. It requires a return to fresh ingredients where sodium is a seasoning, not a preservative substrate. The lung is a delicate organ designed for the gentle exchange of gases, not to be scorched by acid reflux or inflamed by a hyperactive salt-induced immune response. The bowl of instant soup, steaming and savory, is a deceptive comfort,
a saline solution that slowly corrodes the pillars of health.
9. The fungal insurgency, moldy foods, and the aflatoxin threat. In the sanitized aisles of the modern supermarket, we operate under the illusion that our food supply is sterile, controlled, and benign. We view the expiration date as a suggestion and the spot of green fuzz on a slice of bread as a mere nuisance to be scraped away. However, entry number 9, moldy foods, introduces us to a biological antagonist that is ancient, invisible, and devastatingly lethal, the fungus. Specifically, we are investigating the mycotoxins produced by molds, chemical warfare agents synthesized by fungi to protect their territory, which happen to be some of the most potent carcinogens known to science. Among these, aflatoxin B1 stands as the apex predator, a compound so toxic that it rivals industrial chemical weapons in its ability to shatter the genetic integrity of human cells. While the public consciousness associates mold with allergies or an upset stomach, the forensic reality is that chronic exposure to these fungal toxins is a silent driver of genetic mutation, creating a direct pathway to cancer in the liver and, increasingly recognized, the lungs. The investigation centers on 2 specific fungal species, Aspergillus flavus and Aspergillus parasiticus. These molds thrust in warm, humid environments and have a predilection for colonizing oil-rich seeds and grains, peanuts, corn, maize, tree nuts, pistachios, Brazil nuts, and cotton seeds. When these crops are stressed by drought or stored in damp conditions, the mold blooms, often invisibly, and begins to secrete aflatoxin. This is not a rare occurrence, it is a constant global battle. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that 25% of the world's food crops are affected by mycotoxins. When a human ingests these toxins, they are not simply digesting a contaminant, they are absorbing a procarcinogen that requires the body's own metabolic machinery to become lethal. The mechanism of aflatoxin-induced carcinogenesis is a masterclass in molecular tragedy. Upon ingestion, aflatoxin B1 is absorbed into the bloodstream and transported to the liver and other tissues, including the lungs. It is chemically inert in its native form. However, the body's detoxification enzymes, specifically the cytochrome P450 family, CY1A2 and CY3A4, attempt to break it down to eliminate it. In doing so, they inadvertently convert it into aflatoxin 8,9 epoxide. This epoxide is highly reactive and unstable.
It seeks out electron-rich molecules to stabilize itself, and its preferred target is the guanine base in DNA. It binds to the DNA, forming a bulky adduct that physically distorts the double helix. This chemical violence leaves a very specific forensic fingerprint. In the context of cancer genetics, it causes a transversion mutation at codon 249 of the TP53 gene. As discussed in the section on tobacco, the TP53 gene is the guardian of the genome, responsible for ordering a damaged cell to commit suicide, apoptosis. Aflatoxin targets this guardian with sniper-like precision, flipping a guanine to a thymine. This specific mutation, R249S, is so unique to aflatoxin exposure that when pathologists find it in a tumor, it is considered biological proof of the cause. While this mechanism is most famously associated with hepatocellular carcinoma, liver cancer, the lungs are not immune. The lungs possess their own suite of cytochrome P450 enzymes, particularly in the bronchial epithelial cells. Research has shown that lung tissue is capable of bioactivating inhaled or circulating aflatoxin into its carcinogenic form, initiating the same sequence of DNA destruction. The risk to the lungs is dual-pronged, ingestion and inhalation. The inhalation pathway is a critical occupational hazard. Agricultural workers who handle contaminated grain, peanut farmers, and food processing workers are often exposed to organic dust laden with aflatoxin spores. This grain fever or organic dust toxic syndrome is not just an acute respiratory illness, it is a chronic delivery system for carcinogens. Epidemiological studies have found elevated rates of respiratory cancers in workers handling peanut and linseed oils, linking the inhaled dust to pulmonary malignancy. For the general consumer, the risk is primarily dietary, but the systemic circulation of the toxin means the lungs are bathed in the epoxide metabolite, contributing to the total carcinogenic load. We must also confront the clean plate fallacy and the physics of fungal invasion. A common household behavior is to see a spot of mold on a block of cheddar or a loaf of bread, cut off the visible inch of green fuzz, and consume the rest. This is a dangerous gamble. The mold we see, the colorful spores, is merely the reproductive structure of the organism, akin to the flower of a plant. The vegetative body of the mold, the mycelium, is a network of microscopic thread-like roots that penetrate deep into the porous food.
These invisible roots are where the mycotoxins are often concentrated. By the time the mold is visible on the surface of a bag of nuts or a piece of bread, the entire product is likely compromised. Cooking does not save you. Aflatoxins are thermally stable and can survive temperatures up to 500 degrees Fahrenheit, 260 degrees Celsius. You can roast a moldy peanut, bake a moldy loaf, or boil moldy corn, and the poison remains biologically active. The cultural and geopolitical dimensions of this entry are profound. In the developed world, we have the luxury of the FDA and strict agricultural testing. Crops exceeding 20 parts per billion of aflatoxin are rejected for human consumption, often diverted to livestock feed, which poses
poses its own ethical and health problems. In the developing world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, such regulatory infrastructure is often absent and food security is precarious. A subsistence farmer cannot afford to throw away a harvest of moldy corn. It is the only food available. Consequently, these regions suffer from astronomical rates of liver and lung cancers that are directly attributable to diet. It is a stark reminder that cancer is often a disease of poverty and infrastructure failure. Furthermore, the health food trend has inadvertently introduced new risks. The shift toward natural, organic, and preservative-free nut butters and grains removes the chemical barriers like propionates that inhibit mold growth. Raw nuts and seeds, while nutrient-dense, carry a higher risk of fungal contamination than their roasted or processed counterparts if not stored under impeccable conditions. The consumer who buys bulk raw almonds and stores them in a warm pantry for 6 months is creating a perfect incubator for Aspergillus. The rancid, slightly bitter taste of an old nut is not just a flavor defect, it is a warning signal from our evolutionary biology to spit it out. Climate change is poised to exacerbate this threat. As the globe warms and weather patterns become more erratic with increased flooding and humidity, the aflatoxin belt is expanding. Regions that were previously too cool for Aspergillus to thrive are becoming hospitable. This means that the global food supply will face increasing pressure from fungal contamination. Future agricultural models predict a significant rise in mycotoxin exposure in Europe and North America, bringing a problem once thought to be tropical to the doorsteps of the temperate world.
The interaction between aflatoxin and other carcinogens is also synergistic. The risk of cancer from aflatoxin exposure is multiplied, not just added, in individuals who suffer from chronic inflammation, such as that caused by smoking or viral hepatitis. For a smoker, eating a diet high in potentially moldy grains or nuts is akin to disabling the fire alarm while the house is burning. The smoke damages the DNA, and the aflatoxin prevents the repair mechanisms from fixing it. To avoid this risk requires a vigilance that goes beyond the expiration date. It demands a rejection of the waste not, want not mentality when it comes to spoilage. It requires the proper storage of grains and nuts in cool, dry, airtight environments. It means understanding that a single moldy walnut in a bag can contaminate the entire batch with invisible spores. Entry number 9 is a lesson in the lethality of the microscopic. It teaches us that the most dangerous things in our food are often the things that nature put there, not man. To lower the risk of lung cancer is to respect the fungus as a formidable enemy and to ensure that our intake is dry, fresh, and free of the silent rot that signals the presence of the toxin.
The 10th entry in our investigation brings us to a risk factor that is defined not by chemistry but by physics. It is not a molecule, a toxin, or a preservative, but a measurement: temperature. Entry number 10, very hot drinks, exposes the danger of the thermal scald. For millennia, humanity has equated hot food and drink with safety, comfort, and purification. We boil water to kill pathogens. We drink hot tea to soothe a sore throat. Yet modern oncological research has issued a chilling correction to this ancient wisdom. Liquids consumed at temperatures exceeding 149 degrees Fahrenheit, 65 degrees Celsius, act as a physical carcinogen, inflicting repeated thermal injury on the epithelial lining of the upper aerodigestive tract. While the primary statistical link is to esophageal cancer, the implications for lung health are profound, involving the mechanisms of chronic inflammation, microaspiration, and the concept of field cancerization that compromises the entire respiratory gateway. To understand the pathology, we must visualize the anatomy of a sip. When a scalding liquid, be it coffee, tea, or mate, enters the mouth, it travels down the esophagus, which shares a common wall with the trachea, the windpipe. The heat radiates. More critically, the act of swallowing hot liquids often involves the inhalation of steam and microscopic droplets of the fluid. This is known as microaspiration. The delicate tissues of the glottis, the epiglottis, and the upper airways are not evolved to withstand temperatures that can cook protein. At 150 degrees Fahrenheit, cellular proteins begin to denature. The heat kills the surface cells, causing a thermal burn. This is the same biological process as a sunburn occurring on the inside of the body. The body's response to this injury is the crux of the cancer risk. To heal the burn, the basal cells of the lining must divide rapidly to replace the dead tissue. This is a state of hyperproliferation. Every time a cell divides, it must copy its DNA. Every time DNA is copied, there is a small statistical chance of a replication error, a mutation. Under normal conditions, these errors are rare and fixed. But when you drink scalding coffee 3 times a day, every day, for 30 years, you are forcing the cells into a state of constant, frantic division. You are rolling the dice billions of times more than necessary. Eventually, a mutation occurs in a critical gene, like TP53 or P16.
And because the tissue is constantly inflamed and regenerating, the mutated cell is swept up in the growth cycle, expanding into a carcinoma. This phenomenon was solidified in 2016 when the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, reclassified very hot beverages as a Group 2A carcinogen, probably carcinogenic to humans. This was a pivotal moment in epidemiology because it exonerated coffee itself, which was previously suspect, and indicted the temperature.
The evidence came largely from the Mate Belt of South America, Uruguay, Argentina, southern Brazil, and the tea cultures of Iran and China. In these regions, tea is traditionally drunk at near boiling temperatures, often through a metal straw, bombilla, that delivers the hot liquid directly to the throat, bypassing the cooling effect of the lips. The rates of esophageal and upper airway cancers in these populations are staggering, even among those who do not smoke or drink alcohol. The relevance to lung cancer lies in the concept of field cancerization. The entire lining of the mouth, throat, esophagus, and lungs is derived from similar embryonic tissue and is exposed to the same carcinogens. When the upper airway is chronically inflamed by thermal injury, the immune response is systemic. Pro-inflammatory cytokines flood the region. This inflammation weakens the mucosal barrier, the slime layer that traps dust and bacteria. A throat and upper airway stripped of its protective lining by heat is far more permeable to other toxins. This brings us to the deadly synergy, the hot smoke effect. Millions of people begin their day with a hot coffee and a cigarette. This is perhaps one of the most efficient ways to induce malignancy. The hot liquid scalds the lining of the throat and upper bronchial tree via steam and heat radiation, causing vasodilation, widening of blood vessels, and stripping the mucus. Moments later, tobacco smoke, laden with tar, benzene, and nitrosamines, is inhaled over this raw, injured, hypervascularized tissue. The absorption of carcinogens is significantly increased. The heat effectively opens the door, and the smoke walks right into the bloodstream. The thermal injury impairs the mucociliary escalator, the hairs that sweep dirt out of the lungs, trapping the tobacco particulates in the airway for longer periods. Culturally, this entry challenges a deeply held belief that hotter is better. In many Asian cultures,
serving lukewarm tea is a sign of disrespect. In the West, the piping hot coffee is a marketing standard. Fast food chains serve coffee at temperatures near 180–190 degrees Fahrenheit to ensure it stays hot during a commute. This commercial requirement clashes directly with biological safety. The consumer is handed a cup of liquid that is essentially a weaponized thermal agent, requiring them to physically injure their mouth to consume it immediately. The sip and wince reaction is not a quirk, it is a pain signal, a warning from the body's nociceptors that tissue damage is occurring. The investigation also touches on the future of beverage consumption. We are seeing a slow shift. The rise of cold brew coffee and iced teas suggests a changing palate, potentially lowering the population-level risk of thermal injury. However, the allure of the hot drink remains potent. The solution, however, is remarkably low-tech: patience. Waiting 4 to 5 minutes for a drink to cool from scalding 160 degrees Fahrenheit plus to warm 140 degrees Fahrenheit or below eliminates the carcinogenic risk entirely. It is the only entry on this list where the food itself doesn't need to be avoided, only the state of the food. Furthermore, we must consider the impact of microthermal trauma on the laryngeal tissue. The larynx, voice box, sits at the entrance to the lungs. Chronic exposure to hot steam and reflux caused by hot liquids can lead to chronic laryngitis and changes in the cellular architecture of the voice box. Laryngeal cancer is closely linked to lung cancer in terms of risk factors. The heat acts as a promoter, a chronic irritant that pushes cells towards a malignant phenotype. From a philosophical standpoint, the thermal scald represents the danger of excess. Fire allowed us to cook, to survive winter, and to civilize. But in our desire for sensory intensity, we have pushed the use of heat beyond the physiological limits of our tissues. We have normalized a level of consumption that is physically traumatic. The burn of a hot shot of espresso is synonymous with waking up, but biologically it is a micro-trauma. In the final analysis of our top 10 list, the inclusion of very hot drinks serves as a crucial reminder that cancer is not just caused by toxins in the chemical sense, it is caused by chronic stress on the body's repair mechanisms. Whether that stress comes from the radioactive particles of tobacco smoke, the oxidative shock of deep-fried lipids, the metabolic hammer of sugar,
or the physical burn of boiling water, the result is the same: the exhaustion of the body's ability to maintain order. The cell, pushed to the brink by constant injury, eventually rebels. To lower the risk of lung cancer is to lower the noise, the heat, and the violence we inflict on our own biology. It is to let the tea cool, to breathe clean air, and to nourish the body with foods that heal rather than harm. The breath is the essence of life. Protecting the organs that grant it is the ultimate act of self-preservation.